fact that they're now threatening to shut down this war they started and walk away, and then leave the Iranians and the Europeans and the Chinese to work out how they get the fuel out, that's a pretty ballsy move. Yeah, because actually the truth is they know that the Iranians need to sell the oil, and as do the other Gulf states, and they know that India and Pakistan and China and Europe want the energy, and they'll strike a deal that probably doesn't involve a war.
Donald Trump said he can end this war in 2 to 3 weeks, regardless of a deal. Is this realistic?
I mean, I think it's important to realize when he says end this war, he means bombing Iran a bit more and then going away. So, I mean, he can end the war in the sense that if he stops doing the things the Americans are doing, bombing Iran and keeping large amounts of US forces in the region, yes, absolutely, he can end the war in the same way that Vladimir Putin can end the Ukraine war by stopping attacking Ukraine, and we inadvertently ended the Afghan war by pulling all our soldiers out of Afghanistan, at which stage it collapsed. So yes, in that sense, he can end this war. In the sense of the longer-running confrontation with Iran, probably not. That's been going on for since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. That's not going to go away. But yes, if Donald Trump says, I'm going to stop hitting targets in Iran in a day of his choosing in a week's time or 2 or 3 weeks' time, he can do that. And then the question is what the Iranians will do.
Trump has just labelled NATO a paper tiger and said the US is on the verge of leaving the alliance because they failed to send warships to the Strait of Hormuz. If the US withdraws its £3.8 trillion of military might, does NATO even exist by this time next week?
Well, so I think there's several parts of that question. So firstly, America's military might is primarily aimed at the moment at China and currently Iran. So it's not like NATO is getting the full advantage of all of America's military might. But having said that, the presence of particularly US air forces and ground forces in Europe is very important to the deterrence of Russia, particularly the Air Force picture, particularly the ability to strike conventionally into Russia, and also very significant ground forces, both currently based in Germany and Poland, but also that they would commit in time of war. Now, on the other hand, NATO has always been a paper tiger because it is a piece of paper. The North Atlantic Charter is a piece of paper that commits each nation to treating an attack on others as an attack on all, which is a deliberately vague piece of wording. So in that sense, Donald Trump is just saying what's always been true. The question is, do the Russians believe America would not turn up in the event of a major attack on NATO states in Eastern Europe? And the truth is that they still wouldn't know. Yes, Donald Trump could withdraw from the North Atlantic Treaty. I think that's relatively unlikely. If he did, NATO would have to rethink how it did things. I still think the European states would keep it going in its current sort of form because it has command structures that aren't replicated elsewhere. But I think most likely this is not the first time that someone has slammed the table and pulled out, at least slightly. Charles de Gaulle did it in the 1960s. Various US presidents, including Obama, have summoned NATO nations in to call them to account for not spending enough. So I think while this is possibly once again the worst crisis in NATO's history, it's not that much worse than the previous worst crisis in NATO's history, which was Denmark, it was only about 3 months ago, which itself isn't that much worse than that over the Iraq War in 2003 or the Suez Crisis in 1956. So I think, it's a reminder that NATO is something you can't take 100% for granted, but providing the Russians have to take it 50% for granted, then it's still quite an effective deterrent. So I don't think it's changed the future as much as we might think, although it's definitely made the Europeans sit up and start doing more of their own planning.
The West is in a tailspin after those comments. How can Vladimir Putin exploit the situation?
Well, so I mean, the West is in a tailspin, but the West is almost always in a tailspin. The nature of democracy is that every government is losing power slowly, and it is facing its inevitable defeat. Even Margaret Thatcher and Blair were only there for a heartbeat in relative terms, and they both hit crises pretty early on. So, it was by no means guaranteed that Thatcher would have survived as long as she did if you look at her in the early 80s, when incidentally she was dealing with some really messy geopolitics around what they called Euro missiles, so the basing of US nuclear missiles at Greenham Common and elsewhere. So, that did not look a foregone conclusion that she would survive then. Winston Churchill's comment about it being the worst way of running a country aside from all the others remains true. We know Donald Trump is leaving. We know we've got him for 3 years. and then he'll be replaced by someone who may be even more complicated, J.D. Vance, another bunch of problems. But we do actually have this assumption that we're going to keep democratic leaders in the West, and that they're going to keep on coming and going, and that most of them are going to be in crisis quite a lot of the time. Vladimir Putin is in a different situation because he's definitely he has no immediate rivals because he's killed them all, or their helicopters have crashed, or various other things have happened to them. But he's also now in his mid-70s, so he can't last forever. He can obviously, do all the stuff that they do about trying to drive divisions. He is looking at the rise of the far right in places like Germany and France, thinking that's actually a bigger threat to NATO than Donald Trump. If the French pull out, if the Germans pull out, if the French and Germans kick the Americans out, and one of the interesting things happening to the far right in Europe is it's developing some quite interesting characteristics about being both pro-MAGA and anti-MAGA. So both pro-Trump, but also there are elements where you've seen AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, now flirting with the idea of saying, well, the Americans gone. Well, that is going to lead to another bunch of issues. Now, how much of that is being organically generated at the roots of those right-wing parties and how much is Putin, we'll never really know. I suspect a lot of it is organic. But there is an anti-Americanism abroad in Europe now that is in Putin's interest, and he may wish to fan. But of course, the more he fans it, the more he risks upsetting the Americans. So he has a bunch of choices, and in the short term, not unlike Donald Trump, he's going to try and make as few as possible. So the odds are he's going to keep pushing for what he wants in Ukraine, knowing that he won't get it as part of a peace deal and the war will continue, but that is his least worst option. At some stage, the Ukraine war will end and he's going to reposition himself to try and be in a position to attack the most vulnerable points on NATO's flank. And that may well mean Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, particularly Estonia. That's not great news for the UK because we are the framework nation for defending Estonia. The Canadians are for Latvia and the Germans are for Lithuania. So that brings us into a bunch of awkward questions about what we do. So he's got a bunch of stuff, things that he can do. But fundamentally, his greatest opportunity, I would say, is the idea that European politics is going to throw several wheels over the next couple of years, particularly in France and Germany. He doesn't have a German election until 2029, but he'll have a French election next year. And he'll also have a British election in 2029, where if we were on the brink of war, it would be quite difficult for any Labour government to do stuff, because you see we've already got local elections now and they're talking about keeping us out of the Mideast war being one of the things that people like. So lots of complex political fissures that Putin can exploit, but none of them really give him that overwhelming victory that he might want.
Yeah, is there a single European army capable of stopping a Russian advance without American support?
Yes, and it's Ukraine, so that's the first obvious answer. Ukraine, with very limited US support, has managed to hold a very, very concerted Russian assault. I would say the Poles would do pretty well on their own, even if we abandoned them. I would not want to be a Russian army marching into Poland even today, and I definitely wouldn't want to be one in 3 years' time, which is probably how long it'll take them to be ready. I would say the German army even today is pretty meaty, and I would say all of Europe's air forces, particularly all of the F-35s that are coming online at the moment, several hundred F-35s by the middle of the next 5 years, so by the time you get to 2030, really large numbers. The Baltic states, obviously pretty small, but they're also capable of imposing a very high cost on an attacker, and that is going up every year. And it's also worth making it clear that people like the Poles and the Finns, and even the British up in the Arctic, are making it increasingly clear that they would start striking Russia really hard with both long-range air, so that's the F-35, particularly the F-35s operated by the European partners that have more range than our planes that are designed to fly off carriers. But yeah, I think it's pretty, the Baltic states, yes, if Russia throws all of its army at one of the Baltic states, that will be a very painful day. But we're already in we also don't have deep enough weapons stockpiles yet, but that is being managed. And I think also the other thing, we've said this before, but it's worth always repeating. Most of the US weaponry that they're building is aimed at China, so that will not be available to Europe on a dark night. Europe has to fill the gap. And while it does need to do more, the amount of stuff that's going on already is pretty impressive. I was down on the South Coast looking at a factory building unmanned attack boats this week. Really fast growth of capability. Air defense is nowhere near where we need to be at the moment. But by 2030, actually some quite interesting stuff is going to be coming online.
Security chiefs are reportedly in a blind panic. Beyond the money, What is the one black hole the US leaves behind that makes NATO a paper tiger overnight if they were to leave? Any particular weapons systems?
I mean, increasingly no, and that itself is really interesting, right? So there are of the two most potent, the four most potent US warplanes are the B-2 stealth bomber. Europe doesn't have an equivalent of that. America doesn't have many of them, and they're mostly going to be fighting China in a major war. But it allows them to do stuff deep into Russia that the Europeans would struggle to do. Except that the Ukrainians have proved you can do it by hiding a bunch of drones on a truck. So I mean, there is no doubt in my mind that the fine young men and women of Poland and the heirs to SAS rogue heroes are all designing things that can do bad things deep behind Russian lines in innovative and interesting ways, because that's what they're paid for. The Americans have capabilities in that space, but as the Ukrainians have shown, sometimes probably with US support, sometimes without, you can do a lot. If you think your country is threatened and you're an innovative European player, particularly someone like Poland, who really does take this stuff really seriously because they were wiped off the map, there's stuff you can do. The Israelis have shown this as well. The intelligence and the deep radar picture is complicated without the US. NATO does have its own airborne early warning planes, which are the same design as the US uses, the E-3 Sentry. But it also relies on US air-to-air refueling. It relies on US command and control. The simple truth is that US generals are taught to think about commanding armies and navies and air forces on a continental scale. Europeans are not. That's a really hard gap to fill. Although, to be fair, the Americans still run the training courses. So they are putting German generals through those courses, and they are having conversations. So General Grievich, who's the Supreme Commander of NATO, who's a US aviator, is going to be mentoring particularly his German counterparts on how to be me if I'm not there. He's going to be doing that because, for a variety of reasons, his deputy is British, for example. It is entirely possible, for example, that in a major war with China, if the top US general in Europe was killed, they might be succeeded by a German. That might be the conversation that you have, not least because what the Americans provide quite a lot of at the moment, but are ceasing to provide quite quickly, is ground troops. So at the moment, maybe as many as 2,000 US troops across the Atlantic. There's a US long-range missile formation that's just been set up to come to Europe in the event of a crisis. But the truth is that those formations might also be heading to either Asia or the Middle East or even Latin America. So the idea is this war is going to be fought, if it happens, by firstly European volunteers and conscripts, the Balts, so the Baltic states, Germany, Poland. Then if the war goes on for 4 or 5 years, if it ever happens, and I think we'll probably avoid it, we can talk about why, it will be fought by German conscripts and French conscripts and Polish conscripts and volunteers, because large numbers of people are volunteering for military training in Poland. And that is a different dynamic. And I think we touched on this last time we spoke. You've got to remember there are 300 million plus people in Europe, and there are only 150 million in Russia. So that means that Putin starts to run out of people quite quickly. If he's going to run out of people quite quickly, that means he can't afford a long war. If he can't afford a long war, he might not risk a short war. So there is lots of stuff the Americans provide. If they chose to interfere with us by turning off their support to things like HIMARS and F-35, that would be a problem. But that is not what Trump is threatening at the moment. Trump has not said, I've sold you a bunch of kit that I'm going to break. Not least because if he did so, they'd stop buying kit. They're already stopping buying kit because they're worried about it, but they're also spending a lot of money on American kit at the same time because they're hedging. So, there is... everyone is panicking because this looks really dangerous, and everyone is panicking because if this goes on for a particularly long time, we're going to have serious shortages of fuel and other things, and that's a very reasonable thing to be concerned about. But actually, I think, and I was talking to another fellow journalist here, I think behind the scenes quite a lot of sensible activity is taking place. The people who do this, I think, the Americans are incredibly impressive. Those who operate at the top level, it's all very well to sort of mock the Trump administration. But if you're ever in a room with a senior US combatant commander, they are incredibly bright. They often have a PhD. If they don't have a PhD, they have PhD level intellects. They're surrounded by other people with PhD level intellects, all of whom now have their own personal AIs with PhD level intellects. Stuff goes wrong. It's worth, people talk about the Americans starting this war by mistake. They were really put in a box by the Israelis who said, we're going to do this anyway. as far as we can make out. They are still, I think, pretty good at navigating this stuff. And you can see, the fact that they're now threatening to shut down this war they started and walk away, and then leave the Iranians and the Europeans and the Chinese to work out how to get the fuel out. That's a pretty ballsy move. Yeah, because actually the truth is they know that the Iranians need to sell the oil. They know that and as do the other Gulf states, and they know that India and Pakistan and China and Europe want the energy, and they'll strike a deal that probably doesn't involve a war. And they know, and the Americans know they want to get back to facing China, and Trump wants to get on with the midterms. It is. Yeah, it's easy to mock them, but there is actually some quite interesting stuff going on at the moment.
Trump told allies to get their own oil. Can the UK and Europe actually mount a naval mission to free the Strait of Hormuz without American carriers and intelligence?
They could if they struck a deal with China and India. I mean, there are, between them, so China has 3 aircraft carriers, although one isn't really ready for service at the moment. India can certainly field 1. The Italians have 1. So yes, I mean, you could field a 5 carrier strike force relatively easily. Wouldn't be as capable. The French obviously have 1 as well. Wouldn't be as capable as an American carrier strike group, but it'd be fairly capable. But it would also be incredibly capable of striking a deal, because the truth is that the Iranians do not wish to be sinking Indian warships. They do not wish to be sinking European warships, probably. They certainly don't wish to be sinking Chinese warships, which means you probably don't even need the warships. You simply need to do a deal. At the moment, I believe the Iranians are charging about $1.5 million for each cargo through the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, if all the cargoes were going through, it could be a lot less than that. So there are many ways of coming to get the oil, and doing it with the Royal Navy's very limited number of warships is probably not the most sensible way of doing it. Also, don't forget, I'm currently sitting in, looking across the river towards Westminster. But if I was another 2 miles up the river, I'd be looking at the City of London, the insurance market. Providing ships can get insurance to go through the Hormuz Strait and the Iranians can be persuaded not to sink them, then a normal service can be resumed. I mean, don't forget, we've had several moments in the 21st century where global supply chains were on the brink of breaking down. COVID was one. The Icelandic ash cloud was another. So far, and this is a big so far because one day it probably is going to break slightly, so far, those problems have always vanished at the last minute because everyone was so incentivized to make them vanish. If I was a betting man, and Donald Trump definitely is, I would bet that this problem is going to find a way of disappearing before it becomes existential and before we all have to stop flying and driving and turning off our fridges. But, every time we play this game, we get closer and closer to going over the edge, just as India and Pakistan got closer to war than they'd ever been when they had their 4-day war last year. They were firing missiles at each other, shooting down each other's planes. So every time it's one of these sort of play silly games, get silly prizes, attempting to break the global supply system by having something that is almost a war, or is a war, is probably going to really hurt us at some point. I'm not sure it's going to really hurt us this year, but I'm also not 100% sure that it isn't. And that, of course, is the dynamic that makes this such a dangerous kind of new era.
It seems like the Strait of Hormuz is the key to all of this. How does Trump get this open again?
Well, I mean, he just walks away. I mean, if you imagine it wasn't the Strait of Hormuz, but it was a road junction, and you were having a fight across it with a platoon of infantry on one side and a platoon of irregular, Iranian farmers or imagine it's a road in Helmand province, better still, and you're doing lots of military activity on one side. You just go away. And then it's up to the Taliban on the road in Helmand to decide how they run the road afterwards, because you've gone away and you're no longer bombing. Obviously, Trump's going away will be left with a vaguely coded warning to the Iranians not to do things 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we'll bomb you again if you do. The other question is what understanding, informally or otherwise, Israel has reached with Iran. And I would point out that everyone who is currently in a leadership position in Iran is there because Israel haven't killed them. In other words, the people in charge in Iran at the moment are precisely the people that the Israeli security state has decided were worth not killing, or they couldn't kill. We're not going to get an answer to that question, but it does mean that the Israelis don't appear to be devastated with the current sort of situation in Iran. If they were devastated, they would be killing more people. So I think a bit like Venezuela, you're getting into the situation where there's iron fist, velvet glove, and a sort of rapier around the back. So, they obviously both the Americans and the Israelis have the ability to kill individuals in Iran. The individuals in Iran know this. The Americans are going to pull their carriers back to the Pacific and elsewhere at some stage, and they're going to stop the bombing. They're still going to have the ability to restart it if they wish. And then, as I said, it is really, if you are America, you can not quite stop a war by pulling out, because they discovered in Vietnam and Afghanistan that sometimes things just collapse. In the Gulf, though, I don't think the Gulf states are going to collapse if America stops bombing Iran. Israel certainly isn't. And Europe's network of democracies and so forth isn't actually going to collapse either, even if Trump pulled back lots of bombers from here. I think we will find a new normal, and that new normal will have stabilized at a higher level of threat, so maybe even a higher level of violence. So, maybe there'll be occasional drone strikes on Dubai for years to come. Everyone's quite incentivized for that not to happen, but by the same token, it's also quite hard to guarantee that it won't.
The most recent ISW report, their assessment is the degradation of the Iranian leadership is having a massive impact on the level of retaliatory strikes. Is this a job well done for the US? Are their objectives achieved? Or is it just leaving a power vacuum for China and Russia to fill in?
I mean, the answer to that is yes, probably all of the above to varying different quantities. I mean, the saying in Helmand after a while was, well, why are the Taliban so good? Because we've killed all the stupid ones. So, getting rid of a layer of leadership anywhere does not generally leave you with better leadership. And I would again point to the United States here. Everyone is obsessed about Trump and the fact that they think he's a lunatic. Well, we've only got another 3 years of him. He's getting quite old. What people should really be asking is what comes after Trump. Because actually that is the longer term, even on a 5-year time horizon, by 2030, we'll be in the second year of the next US president. So, there is a limit to how much we want to obsess about the amount of damage Trump can do, because actually what we really need to be looking at is what the new normal post-Trump feels like. And I don't think we spend enough time discussing that. Same true in Iran. I mean, obviously, there is clearly a Russo-Iranian relationship, which, if the missiles aimed at Diego Garcia have the range that people are talking about them having, implies that in exchange for the Shahed drone technology that the Russians are using in Ukraine, they have quite significantly upgraded Iran's ability to build conventional ballistic missiles. That shouldn't be a surprise. In fact, the surprise is that we were surprised by it. The Russians have had the ability to drop conventional ballistic missiles on London from Russia since about 1950. And they did it by re-engineering things the Germans had built, 85 years ago. So we're talking about century-old technology. We're talking about, to put it in context, this technology is only slightly more modern than the Flying Scotsman steam engine built in 1929. So, the fact that the Iranians may have something that can do that should not be a surprise. I mean, we know that Trump is seeing Xi Jinping in less than a month. They will discuss what they think the Middle East should look like, and neither of them wants to own it. They may both agree that actually going forward, what they want is European military sort of clout to be the restraint on Iran alongside Israeli. Do they want the UN involved? Really interesting opportunity for the UN Security Council to get back together, because if the Americans and the Chinese agree on a UN sort of Middle East approach to the Strait of Hormuz, then that's a world we can operate in fine. And they could do that. Is there a world in which US CENTCOM is the powerful sort of gorilla on one side in the Middle East and a Chinese UN task force is the other? Is that a sort of deal they could do? Don't forget, the Americans would really like to get the Chinese Navy out of the Pacific. If China always had an aircraft carrier in the Middle East, that would be great for America, because it would be one fewer Chinese aircraft carrier in the Pacific. I mean, the Trump administration are deal makers, and for them, nothing is ever off the table. So the deal with China that they strike, which will not be around Taiwan, they'll agree to disagree over Taiwan. They may even agree they have a small war over Taiwan at some point. But if they can find common ground over the Middle East, maybe around that board of peace, maybe the board of peace gets to do Hormuz as well as Gaza. That definitely builds China's brand if that's where the deal goes. Or they may find they can't get on at all, because again, you always know. Again, think of a gangland dynamic. The two sort of ethnic mafias walk into a room. Imagine it's the Italians and the Chinese in New York. Sometimes they just find out they hate each other, and they find there is no deal to be done, and they walk away, and it gets worse. That is what the world looks like on a global stage at the moment. Trump is quite happy with that dynamic. He came up through New York real estate, but that is certainly the way Xi Jinping and Trump see the world. But again, both old men. They're not going to be in charge in 15 years' time. They may not even be in charge in 5 in Trump's case. So we move on to that deal making with a bit of violence.
How does this isolationist turn from Trump affect the special relationship? And where does Sir Keir Starmer sit in all of this?
So I'm afraid Sir Keir Starmer sits where most British prime ministers have been, which is that they have vastly overrated their ability to influence the United States and are discovering abruptly that they don't actually have that much influence at all. Tony Blair clearly found himself in that position, particularly over Iraq. Tony Blair is unusual because he deliberately abandoned the position that we could influence America. So his view was that we had to back them up regardless. Harold Macmillan, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, sort of believed that he was mentoring a young Kennedy. Very, very clear from the American declassified stuff afterwards that was not how Kennedy saw it at all. So Starmer has done what British prime ministers always do, which is try and get in the pocket of the President of the United States. And he's now discovered what British prime ministers also then discover, which is that the US president has several meetings a day and telephone calls with his closest foreign friends, because that is how they refer to Canada, Israel, Japan, Germany, even France. One of the horrific discoveries that British diplomats make in Washington is that the nuclear relationship between France and the US looks incredibly sophisticated, and no one will tell the British what's in it. So, but it may be at least as deep as the British, possibly even more so. Certainly, we do know from the broader historical record that the Americans helped the French get ballistic missiles, and that worked. We had to borrow the Americans. The French built their own through Airbus. So, to an extent, he's just been on the same journey all prime ministers are. This one has been more embarrassing, I think, partly because within the UK, people view crawling to Trump with a degree of contempt that they didn't view trying to crawl to Obama or Kennedy or even Reagan. And Thatcher's relationship with Reagan was more sophisticated than this. The problem is that Trump likes kicking someone when he's down, and Trump also has, I'm not sure Keir Starmer necessarily does, a sense of humor. And in Trump's case, it's a vicious sense of humor. And things like that Saturday Night Live sketch, which quite a lot of people found amusing, Trump also found amusing. And it's hard to imagine how you could find that amusing if you're Keir Starmer.